Today we are talking about deploying multiple queue lists. In putting this session together, I sort of, this is a ball of yarn that can unwind very, very far. There's a lot of things that you can do with multiple queue list environments. There's a lot of variations, right, because this is sort of one of the core structures of EOS playback. So in preparing this today, I wanted to give an overview of sort of the different ways that we think about multiple queue lists and some of the basic things to be thinking about in regards to playback. I'm sure there's a lot of things that maybe you've run into individually. I'll leave plenty of time for questions, but I wanted to make sure you just had a good understanding of some of the bigger ideas that are behind a multiple queue list environment and the ways we deploy them. So let's dig in. First of all, sort of what are multiple queue lists, right? EOS, many of you work in single queue list environments, which is great. You have all the tools available to you in a single queue list environment. A full stack of queues that we generally expect will play back linearly as you go through performance. EOS has the ability to give you multiple of these, so you can store, up to almost 1,000 of these individual queue lists, and you can play them back in different ways. So the rules don't really change when you go from a single queue list to a multi-queue list environment, with the exception of you now have more stacks of queues that you need to manage. So some of the navigation is a little bit different, and some of the tools are a little bit different. So all of these same rules still apply, right? We still give you the same numbering structure. You can have point queues, you can have part queues. Your follows and hangs can work internally, and actually we'll talk in a little bit. Those can help you in a lot of ways when you're dealing with multiple queue lists, because those follows and hangs work within a single queue stack. Any behavior that you pick for back from first or go from last will still apply, and that can give you some interesting things as well. It's important to remember, if you've worked in a single queue list environment for a long time, you're probably comfortable with this and may not have even thought about it. But we only allow you to have one queue on stage at a time, right? You can't have Q1 and Q5 contributing from the queue list at the same time. And that becomes true when you expand this out into multiple queue lists. Each queue list can only be contributing one queue at a time, and that is a good thing, and we'll see how we can manage that and make that useful. There's also one carrot, right? What we've called the carrot, which is, you can see on my graphic there, not just the queue that is active, but you can have a queue that's highlighted, right? So in live, if you hit shift next and last, you will see that your highlight moves, and that's the queue that's on your command line. So when we do timing, we do labeling, things like that, that gives you that information, and that can be useful when we're talking about a pending queue. And then the other big thing, and we're going to spend a little bit of time on this as an introduction, is going through move fade behavior. The desk deals with move fade as one of its core philosophies, and I think having some good understandings of that will be sure that you're successful, because we need to think a lot about that when we're dealing with multiple sources potentially trying to control the same channels. Where all this lives, just a quick little reminder if you haven't been in here, what I call the queue list, which isn't particularly accurate. It's the queue list index. This is tab 16. It allows you to go in and see all of the queue lists you have stored in your show file, and it allows you to change the properties at a list level. So there are a lot of things that have to do in here with certain playback things that we're not going to really dive deep into today, like priority handoffs and things like that. But if those are some things that we have time for and you want to ask questions, I'm happy to go through those. But know that all that stuff is in your cue list index. So why would we use multiple cue lists? And in preparing for this, I kind of thought of this question as what are the types of ways that we would apply a cue list? And I think that that is informative. And so I broke it up into 3 general categories. We can use multiple cue lists for linear playback. And as we see when we get into the section, that means that there's a single cue on stage at a time, and every cue controls potentially every single light, right? So we're playing these things back, but maybe for the purposes of organization or for the purposes of tracking and editing, we wanted these things to be in multiple cue lists, and we'll look at that in a little bit. The next one is something that we use in linear theater pretty often, which is something that I called a channel handoff, which means that you have a main cue list that is basically a single cue list environment, but you may want to, at a certain point in the show, break off certain channels and allow them to do something more complex with a secondary cue stack, and then return them back to the main list. I kind of put that busking is kind of like a channel handoff. I didn't talk a lot about busking so far as a multi-cue list environment in this presentation, but suffice to say, taking something like a base cue and letting small groups of channels go off and do their own things and then return to the base cue is something that is similar to a channel handoff. So if we have some extra time, we can talk about that. And then there's also concurrent playback, and this is the way that a lot of very large commercial events in theater tend to work, where we have multiple programmers. And this really is for organizational purposes. It gets to a point where, with certain time constraints, a rig can be too large for a single programmer, and so we can break up portions of the rig and put them in a dedicated cue list that a programmer has control over. And then when we go to playback, the sum of all those cue lists is what actually makes the stage look right. So we'll dig into that a little bit. But first, I wanted us to go a little bit through move, fade behavior. And this may be a review for a lot of you, but I think it's pretty foundational. And so apologies if it's review for you, but let's make sure that we all are on the same page. It's pretty common to say that EOS is a tracking console, right? That's something that we describe EOS as a sort of a DNA characteristic. But that isn't completely true. Tracking is actually an incidental behavior of a move fade environment. And what does that mean? The way that going to the way back machine, and I'm sure some of you have seen these and played with these. This is a resistor board, and before computerized lighting, this was what controlled a lot of spaces, right? So you had a handle per dimmer, and if you wanted to have an electrician, if you wanted the lights to come on, you would tell an electrician, in Q1, go over to handle 5 and put it up to 50% or to full or whatever. And so when computerized lighting came into theaters and spaces, this was a behavior and a way of working that a lot of lighting teams wanted to duplicate. So some of the earlier computerized lighting systems sort of duplicated the way that this works. And I'm going to take it through, I'm going to go through with you from a manual standpoint. So let's pretend that we're lighting a show on one of these manual resistor boards. And we're going to use what's called a track sheet, right? So this is literally a sheet of paper that an electrician has, and it's a grid, and the lighting designer would say, if I want dimmer 1 to come up in Q1, I would write on my track sheet that I need to pull that dimmer up in Q1. And so when Q1 was called, I would walk over to dimmer 1 and pull the fader up to full, and that's where the light would go. If in Q2 then I wanted dimmer 2 to go to 50, as an electrician, Q2 would be called, I'd walk over to dimmer 2 and I'd push the handle up. Each of these is called a move instruction, right? It's literally an instruction to go move a handle. And so in Q2, what happens to dimmer 1, right? As we know, it stays on, right? Because I didn't give the electrician a move instruction to walk over to handle 1 and change it anyway. So handle 1 is going to stay in the position that I left it until I tell it to go somewhere else. And I like to say that life is tracking, right? You walk into a room, you turn on a light switch. How long is that light switch going to stay on? Until you walk over and turn it off again. So back to our track sheet. One of the things that will become important later, but I wanted to bring this up right now, is that you'll notice in Q1, we haven't talked to dimmer 2 at all. We have no move instruction. What we'll find out in computerized lighting is that's what's called a null instruction, right? There's no value, there's no anything there. So this cue list in a computerized system hasn't taken ownership of dimmer 2 until it gets its very first move instruction. That can bite you, and we'll talk about it in a little bit. So moving on, let's say we've written all of our cues through our first run. And again, the least complicated show ever written, right? Like, Q1, dimmer 1 turns on to full. It doesn't turn off until Q6 when we tell it to turn off. We tell the electrician to walk over and bring both of our dimmers down to 0. Dimmer 2 has had some level changes in the interim cues. So let's really talk quickly about editing and where tracking comes from. So this that we've been describing is move fade behavior, right? It's the move side of move fade behavior, which is to say nothing is going to change unless I give it a move instruction, period. That is how these things work. So if we go to edit, if I decide that I no longer want dimmer 1 to be at full at Q1, I erase that level and I put a new level in. So now I'm sitting at channel 75, or excuse me, at level 75. What is going to happen to that is it's going to change that level until I have a new move instruction, right? So I think this is where move fade and tracking scare a lot of people, because you make a change to a cue after you've done your first pass, and it changes all the cues that you didn't want it to. This is because we didn't tell our electrician in Q2 to go back and restore it, right? There's another mode of operation which is called a preset desk, which is what expression operate under. And instead of storing just move instructions, a preset desk records every channel for every cue, right? So that sort of operation isn't a problem in a preset desk when we make an edit, because Q2 already has the knowledge to store dimmer 1 at full. So in a move fade system, we have what's called cue only modification. So if I do the same edit where I erase full and I put in 75, when I use cue only, either in a mode or as a command line instruction, the board knows in the next cue to put another move instruction in to put me back at full, right? So cue only edits are the way that we allow ourselves in a move fade environment to prevent tracks and keep those changes contained. When we add a new light in a move fade environment, again, if a bunch of cues already exist, If I put a light in the Q1 and I've never touched that light, it's going to go on for forever, right? In theory, if this were a manual handle board, if I didn't tell the electrician at some point to turn it off, we would close the doors on the theater at the end of the night and the light would still be on, right? Like, this is something that is expected behavior in a move fade environment, that adding a new move instruction without any subsequent move instructions below it will cause that to track through all of your cues. Again, we can use a instruction to help that away you go. And this feels a little bit like the Wild West, and I think one of the things when folks are just starting to get into understanding move fade and getting comfortable with how tracking works and how it can be beneficial in editing, we get a little afraid because it's like, okay, now I add a light and it goes through my whole show. Blocks are an editing tool that allow you to wrangle some of this and break your cue chunks into manageable parts like scenes or acts or musical numbers or whatnot. So when we block a cue, what we're actually doing is putting a little roof on the cue, right? So if Q6 is blocked, there's a little roof above Q6 that says nothing else is allowed to come in from above. That's a tracked value, right? I'm going to preserve everything that's in my queue right now, right? So those happen to be zeros for dimmers 1 and dimmer 2. But if I add a new light, like dimmer 3, and that goes to track through, Q6 is basically, as a block, is like a permanent queue only, right? It will convert to a move instruction to preserve the value of that dimmer before we change it up above, right? So these are some of the basics. I think it's important to just have this as a foundation because move instructions and move fade is important when we start having multiple cue lists or other types of playback targets grab for the same channels, right? Who wins and why, there's a really clear and expected logic, and if you understand that logic, you can use your advantage. Another quick reminder that we give you color coding. The only way I got through lighting classes in school was remembering blue sky, green grass, right? Blue are levels that are increasing from their previous value. Green are levels that are decreasing from their previous value. And magenta is tracking, right? So these are values that haven't changed. I'll say that this is for intensity parameters, right? When we deal with non-intensity parameters, you'll see move instructions in blue. And that's because it's kind of, doesn't really matter with non-intensity parameters what is higher and what is lower, right? If you abstract the control away from the DMX values, which is higher, purple or red, which is higher, stage left or stage right. So we display move instructions in blue for non-intensity parameters, and we give you mark values in green. So that's a good way to remember that. The other thing that I didn't put on here, white will denote blocked values. And it's important to remember that block is just an edit function. It's not a playback function. So blocks just prevent us when we're editing our data from that stuff from tracking through into other cues. We're going to focus primarily on playback tools today because a lot of this handoff stuff has to do with playback. So block still works in multiple cue list environments. So if we have questions about that, let me know, but block is just for editing. The other thing that we do as a shortcut in EOS is we give you a hyphen for a tracking zero. So anything that's a zero value, you're going to see this little hyphen. And that's just a way to visually reduce the noise, right? So you can quickly scan a monitor and get the information that you need more quickly. It's just a convention. So hopefully it is useful now that you know what it does. So I'm going to go through a linear playback option, and then I see a couple of questions. We'll get to those when we get through this portion of the section. So linear playback, as we talked about in our introduction, linear playback is one cue on stage at a time. And some reasons that we might decide to do something like this, a really common use for multiple cue lists in a linear playback world is something like a dance show, right? So you may have 6 or 7 pieces that you have going on, but you're tacking them out of order. You need to cue them individually. And you may even have different orders night to night, or there may be some acts that aren't going on, things like that. So queuing each piece in its own cue list allows you to avoid tracking into other cues, right, that may be completely separate in intent. It also allows you to rearrange those with a little bit of ease, right? So it takes those cues and kind of packages them up and allows you to put them in whatever order your set list might be for the night. I mentioned dance because we see that pretty common, but this can also go for live music if you're using cue lists for music. Again, a set list will allow you to rearrange these things. For education, light lab projects, making sure that last person in the light lab before the project is due doesn't have the lowest number of cues and then tracks through everybody else's stuff, and then they're all mad. Not that that ever happened before. So I think there's a lot of applications for doing linear playback, but the key thing is that there's only one cue on the stage at a time, and each cue is expected to control every single light in the rig, right? Whether it's on, whether it's off, whether it's blue, whether it's purple, that each individual cue has access to all lights. And I think that'll become apparent with some other options. So we've got cue list 1. It's all channels. Again, not a massive show. I'm doing 9 channels for these examples. But we've got some looks, and that's great. And let's say that's our dance piece 1, and then we've got a second dance piece which we've queued with some different looks, and that's dance piece 2. So we decide that we want to run those concurrently, right? So I want to leave cue 5 in cue list 1 and play directly into cue list 2, cue 1. And so the way that we can do that is by using a link command, right? So just like in a standard cue list, if you kind of want to jump around in a single cue list, you can use link, and that just puts whatever cue you're linking to as the pending cue, and when you hit go, it automatically jumps to that cue number that's been pending. This works exactly the same when you're jumping into multiple cue lists. So what this basically gives you, I tried to have like an animated graphic where these things went and WebEx something like that. So you get static graphics, unfortunately. So when we start to look at this in sort of a linear playback form, what we get here is exactly what we're going to expect when we link out of cue 5, we're going to play cue 1. So when we start thinking about these things, when we get into a multiple cue list environment, one of the things we just want to think about is cue 1 doesn't exist anymore, right? Cue 5 doesn't exist anymore. As soon as you record a second cue list, you now need to start thinking about list and cue number, because every single cue list can have from 0.001 to 9999.999, right? We allow those to be the same. So it's a little bit of a mind shift, and it's something that you will want to watch your command line for in particular to see what queue you're talking to and what list. But know that now this is how this is going to play back, right? We've got queue list 1/1 through 5. We go on 5, and on our master fader pair or wherever we're running this from, queue list 1 is replaced with queue list 2. and now we are in queue list 2 and running Go linearly through there. So that's good, right? That makes us happy. So one of the things to pay attention to, though, and just keep in mind, is this transition point, right? So we're handing off from one whole queue list to another whole queue list, right? So you might expect that because there's only one move instruction here, that these values would continue to track through and allow you to sort of meld those two together. When, in fact, what's going to happen is because we're transitioning to a whole new queue list, we are going to give you an assert on intensity parameters, right? So in this instance, all of my other channels are going to fade to 0 with the exception of channel 3. And so that will make sure that the entirety of Q2/1 for intensities looks the same, right? And so that's another smiley thing, right? We don't have to worry about what order we put these queue lists in. It will play back as if Q2/1 was the first queue we've ever played. However, we only do that for intensities, right? And what is the rule, right? The rule for move fade is that parameters won't change unless acted upon by another move instruction, right? So what that means is that you could have a grumpy time where, you know, your lights, if these are LED lights, they were mixed to red, and you wanted them in blue, but you only have an intensity move in Q2/3 or whatever, right? So you can get some unexpected results with that. So just be aware. Something that a lot of folks do is what I call a blue 0 queue. So this is the very first queue in a queue list. If we just have all of our channels at home in the top of a queue list, they are null values, right? They don't have any move instructions stored. These null values are not going to act upon what's happening here. So a lot of programmers will record a very first queue, which includes just everything at home, right? So you can reset things to values. You can build transition looks into that, right? If you need lights that are blue backlight because you're transitioning between pieces or something, you can certainly build that in, but know that it's something that you need to deal with when you're doing some handoffs, right? So blue 0 queues are useful as a tool. Just a quick little sidebar. You may experience similar behavior in go-to-queue behavior, right? So the reason that is because go-to-queue is doing a similar thing to a linked queue, right? Which means that it is a go-to-queue 0 is resetting all the intensities to 0, right? It's putting Q1 as pending, so if you were to hit go on your playback, it would go into Q1 again, or your lowest number queue, whatever that is. And it leaves all non-intensity parameters alone. So this has happened to a lot of folks I know, where at the end of the night, even a single queue list environment, they say go to Q0, enter. They come in the next day, they hit go, and maybe they were relying on the home value of some of their lights in the first couple queues. So their lusters were homed at a warm white, but now they're blue for the first 3 queues. And that's because the Q0 did not reset those non-intensity parameters. And when you get into that situation, the only thing that can change them is the next move instruction, right? So if the lights were set to change red in Q3, they're still going to do that, but they may be in their last queue color until they reach that point. So again, this is where something like blue 0 is good. Go to queue out is a useful tool because go to queue out does similar things as a go to queue 0. It puts all the intensities at 0. It makes the lowest queue number be pending, but it puts all non-intensity parameters to their home value, right? So this is super, super useful. Both go to queue 0 and go to queue out can be used on a per queue list basis. So go to queue 1/0, go to queue 2/0 will do exactly that. It will set the intensities of the channels that that queue list owns, put in 0, same with go to queue out, right? So those can be useful tools, especially if you get into more of a busking situation where you're not stacking things linearly, but you need to jump around a bit more. And finally, when you were saying go to queue 15, for example, we assert all parameters. We want you to be at exactly the place that you would be if you were playing through to queue 15 linearly. So that is a place where we say we are going to do a temporary playback assert on that whole queue to get you where you are for all channels that have been stored into that queue list, right? And so if you've never stored channels 101 through 1,000,000 into queue list 1, and another queue list has that, go to queues won't touch those fixtures, right? If they've ever been used in that queue list, they will. So keep that in mind. I have a question break here for linear playback, and I know some stuff has come in. So feel free to add some more questions, but I see some stuff, so I'm going to answer that. Tony asks, when deleting queues, I always have to pause to figure out if I want to delete track or queue only. Thank goodness for undo. Indeed. Is there a simple way to think of deleting track or queue only? Yeah, when you're deleting a queue, you know, we are just going to delete those move instructions, right? So things that that move instruction would have been preventing from tracking through, if that move instruction's gone, now those things are going to pour through. Things that that move instruction would have created are now going to be removed, so those tracks won't exist. I kind of think that for most delete queues in a linear playback sequence, you're probably wanting to delete most stuff queue only because you don't want stuff below it to change, right? So deleting queue only will allow you to very easily, the board does a lot of magic in the background to preserve whatever is your next remaining queue that you haven't deleted, and put move instructions in to sort all that out. You may get some auto blocks if you do that. Auto blocks are completely safe. If we don't understand auto blocks, let me know, and if we have time at the end, we can certainly talk about those. But yeah, you should be able to go. And don't forget that if you're deleting a range of queues, you can say delete queues 11 through 15, queue only, and that will remove that whole bank of queues and put a queue only on queue 16, right? So deleting ranges of queues, that should be safe as well. So I think that generally you want to delete queue only if you're working in a tracked environment, but I think that there are some reasons that you might want to go in and delete a queue that creates tracks. My spidey sense is that that is less often. So there we go. Yes, Dennis is saying that they use queue only for all their programming in EOS, and they don't have a problem with it. Yes, so, and I think that's the key thing to remember. Queue only is a totally acceptable mode to work in. Queue only doesn't change move fade behavior, right? So if you're recording queues in order, if you've got a blank show file and you type 1 at full enter and you record channel 1 into Q1, if you start working on Q2 and you say 1 at full enter and you record Q2, you're still going to get a tracked value, right? When you're building linearly, we throw away redundant move instructions because we're not going to save those for you. That's why when someone says ES is a tracking desk, it's not fully truthful, because tracking is something that is incidental instructions. When you're working in queue only, all the board is doing is in the background adding those additional move instructions for you when you make changes or when you delete things or things like that. So it doesn't turn it into a preset desk under the hood like an Express, where Express would record every value for every queue all the time. It doesn't fundamentally change that behavior. So there's a really good video that was produced a very long time ago called Bobblehead Fred, which is ETC's founder, Fred Foster, has a little bobblehead of himself. And that character talks you through some of this stuff in a really easy to digest form. So happy to answer questions, but that's a good resource as well. Let's see, a quick one in here. Does go to Q0 default to a specific queue list? Yeah, it's going to default to whatever's on your command line. So in a single queue list environment, that's almost always queue list 1, right? When you say record Q5, enter for the first time, we assume that you're creating queue list 1. As soon as you get into a multiple queue list environment, though, we're going to do whatever is on your command line. So again, I think keeping an eye on what is on that command line, it will tell you live Q2/8 or whatever. To do it to a different queue list, you can say go to Q5/0, and even if your command line is appointed at that queue list at that moment, it will take that queue list back to Q0. If you're working with a lot of queue lists, maybe having some macros that do that, especially in like a busking environment, if you're using multiple queue lists as different base looks or things like that, having a per queue list go to Q0 or go to Q out may be a useful thing to have on something like a direct select or a magic sheet, just to like reset those targets. Again, be really careful what it does if all of those queue lists are sharing the same channels. I think this will make a bit more sense in the next section, but ownership matters. So just be careful if you've got those channels active in another queue list, and now you send another queue list to 0, you may accidentally black out state, which is never good. Let's see. Are null values for non-intensity parameters using the fixture's home values or home preset information? Good question, Joel. The answer is yes. So if a home preset is defined and there are values for that parameter, anytime the channel is expected to be at home or a parameter is expected to be at home, it looks at the home preset first and sends it there. If there's no value stored in the home preset or no home preset is defined, then it uses the profile defaults for home. So it kind of does both in a way. So if there are things that the home preset that comes with the fixture is fine, you don't need to worry about defining that in a home preset. Brad asks when you want to provide an example of when you would want to go to Q0 instead of Q out. Yeah, Q0 is a really easy way to get a blackout, right? So when you're building a linear show, a theatrical show, go to Q0 will keep all of your non-intensity parameters exactly as they are, take your intensities to 0, and you can store that as the next Q for a blackout. So that is a pretty useful thing in a linear. There are times when, and I think this has to do more with some of the more complex things that we won't get into necessarily today, but when you want to be able to bring things down and transition intensities, and then let the move instructions pick up later, I'm thinking of more themed environment type things or experiential spaces than straight playback. But there's certainly a use where you would want those to allow whatever the state of those lights to be in was there, and then have the intensities up, and then make your changes whenever they're ready to make your changes. So good question, Brad. Michael asks, what determines what the queue on your command line is? Is there a way to lock queue list on the command line? Kind of. We sort of lock it. So whatever the last queue list you spoke to is what's going to be there, right? So if I am typing and working on queue list 1, and then I say queue2/enter, then I can use all the same shorthand that I would use in a single queue list environment. The board tries to make it easy. It doesn't, as soon as you add a secondary queue list, you don't have to always say Q2/Q1/. You can use the same shorthand, Q5 times 8, then it will use whatever queue list you've been working in, right? Again, if you find that you need to switch between queue lists with frequency, having some command line macros that just are Q5/enter clear can give you a quick way to move between those things. They're confident in that. Great. So those are the questions that have come in for now. Again, feel free to ask more questions. And at the next break, I will get to them. So let's talk about sort of the next type of queue list, which is channel handoff. And again, this can be something that's for we use sometimes in more traditional theatrical linear playback settings, but also busking, like live event, punting, needing to steal some channels away to do a little thing over here, and then let them come back. So there's some tools in here that I think are applicable on a broader scale, but I'm going to stick with the queue, like the super effect, we'll call it, in a linear queue stack. So the big thing is that the main queue list generally owns all the channels and is controlling all the channels, but at a certain point in the show, we want a queue list to steal away a couple of channels, do whatever we need it to do with those channels, and then let it go back to being controlled by a main queue list. So a quick little thing here, right? We've got a single queue list. We've got 10 queues, and all of our delightful queues and looks are done. We then record our effect case or whatever we want our thing to do, right? So this is a really simple queue list who just has 4 queues that take it to 50, 40, 60, and then off. So nothing complicated. I think I will say it explicitly in case I didn't say it explicitly enough previously. I'm just doing intensity examples in all of these. All of this stuff pertains to each individual parameter as well, right? So if you think of this instead of channels 1 through 9 as intensities, this could be intensity, pan, tilt, edge, zoom, red, green, blue, whatever. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we go through these examples. I didn't dig that deep in. All of this applies equally to those parameters as well. The quickest way to say I want, Q1/3 to fire concurrently Q2/1 is to use our execute soft key. So with Q1/3 on the command line, hit execute, type in Q2/1, enter, and now when you hit go on Q1/3, it's going to call automatically another go on Q2/1, right? So the key thing here, and I think I got these slides out of order, but what's different now is both queue lists are active and contributing a queue to the stage. In our linear playback, Q1/5 got replaced with Q2/1. So queue list 1 was no longer contributing. It was inactive. It didn't exist. And that's an important differentiation here. Right now, both of these queue lists will be trying to output their values to the stage. And it's important, and I did this example very intentionally, channels 1 through 5 are owned by both queue lists. You can see that 8, 9, and later on 6 and 7 are not owned by queue list 2. So they will continue to behave uninterrupted, right? Queue list 2 can't access them as long as queue list 2 has never stored in any of its queues channels 6 through 9. So that's useful, that's beneficial. Be sure to know that when you're trying to build some of these things. If you put zeros somewhere or you accidentally store home values or whatever for channels that you don't intend to use, queue list 2 will take ownership of them. A couple of things to think about when you're syncing playback in this way. Do you want to synchronize playback? So when I hit go on 1/3, I want 1 to go. When I hit go on 1/4, I want 2/2 to go. I can hit execute commands in each of those queue list 1 lists and call out any queue number to run, right? It's just basically software hitting go on queue list 2 for me. So keep that in mind. You can synchronize playback in sort of any way you fancy. For automatic playback, maybe I only want to say, I want queue list 2 to start, but it's more of effect. I want it to chase, I want it to roll, or I want a single shot thing to happen. Follows and hangs work. So as soon as you say go on 2/1, if it is a follow or a hang, it will call that, and it will behave in the way that you expect, which is super useful. You can have a cascade of things happen off of a single execute in the main queue list. So that's a good thing. You can also use links and loops. So if this thing needs to go a couple of times or in infinity until you need to tell it to stop, you can use links and loops to have that queue list continue to loop, right? So use those tools the way that you would in a single queue list environment. They will behave the same. Just know that an execute is the software is calling a go, so you don't have to hit it. Okay. So what happens? We're starting to understand ownership here in this slide, right? When I hit go on queue list 2/1, I have move instructions for channels 1, 2, 3, and 5, and so those values are going to go to be in queue list 2, right? So you can see down here, I have a little thing that says, here's what live, right? Here's what we would actually be outputting. So channels 1, 2, 3, and 5 are owned by queue list 2 at this point. And channel 4 is owned by queue list 1. And I made a mistake in this slide. Because I recorded channel 4 into Q4, this would actually send this channel to 0, right? The reason is that I stored channel 4 in queue list 2 at some point. If I were better at doing this presentation for you, I intended to leave channel 4 blank completely, in which case this would be true, which is that channel 4 wouldn't be touched by queue list 2 because queue list 2 never tried to take control of it. So I guess my mistake brought up a good conversation point, I hope. So I hope you understand that with no value stored would make what this would be down here true, which was the point of this example. Queue list 1 is still active, right? Queue list 1 is still contributing values, but I kind of changed the colors of these because these values are no longer contributing. Queue list 2 has taken ownership of those values. And that's because they had the most recent move instruction, right? Remember that we said that a light will only change if there is a move instruction for it. Well, guess what? By hitting go on 2/1, whether I did it manually or whether the board did it through an execute, I've given those channels move instructions. So now they take control and those channels are owned by queue list 2. So when we get into these situations where multiple sources, multiple queue lists, multiple subs, or whatever, are trying to gain ownership of lights that are shared, we need to understand who owns what and why, right? So I hope that's clear, right? Queue list 1 is still active. Q1/3 is still active. Queue list 2 is now active and has stolen ownership of 4 of those channels. If I hit go on queue list 2, those channels change, but again, channel 4 doesn't change because queue list 1 still has ownership of it. I've given those channels new move instructions from queue list 2, Q2, but I haven't given any move instructions to channel 4, so it stays where it is. Channels 6 through 9 were never owned by this queue list, so they also don't change. So that's an important thing. If in this state I were to hit go on queue list 1, however, there are move instructions for all 5 of these channels. So all 5 of these channels would have their ownership returned to queue list 1, and they would go to 0, right? Because the last move instruction that these channels got was from queue list 1. So put kind of an easier way, I put tracked values in queue list 1 for every place that there are values or that there are queues in Q2 or queue list 2. So no move instructions to Q1. Again, I execute queue list 2 from queue list 1. The same ownership rules apply with the exception of my mistake. I hit go on queue list 1, and now nothing happens because there are no move instructions for those channels in Q1/4. I hope that makes sense because that's kind of fundamental to how these things hand off, right? And this is going to matter when we try and return these channels from being owned from queue list 2 back to queue list 1. So one of the things you can always remember is don't forget about asserting a queue. Assert is a playback function. Assert says give all of my values regardless of whether they're tracked or not. Play them back like they're a move instruction. So if you were to assert Q1/4, that would have brought all those channels back to queue list 1. Don't forget that we allow you to do discrete asserts, right? So you can say assert just these channels, and away you go. But remember that discrete asserts, you can only assert a move instruction. So just be aware of that. Okay. So let's talk about giving the channels back. So we've taken ownership of them. We're comfortable with that. Queue list 2 has them. Queue list 2 does whatever it does for as long as we want it to do it. And at some point, we want to hand back control to queue list 1. One of the ways we could do that, as we just talked about, is, if all of this is happening between when I fire Q1/2 and when I fire Q1/3, then all I need is an assert or move instructions in Q1/3, and it'll automatically take ownership of those channels again, right? That is just by the nature of ownership by move instructions. But maybe this is running a loop, or maybe I don't know where I'm going to be in my queue list 1 when I need to hand over ownership. So an assert may not be the best thing to pull those values back, right? Maybe we want queue list 2 to say, I'm done with these, as opposed to queue list 1 saying, give them back to me. I put a slide here explaining those very things. So where in queue list 1 are you? What about the auto playback, right? Even if I have move instructions in queue list 1 that pulls them back, if this thing is looping, as soon as the next move instructions hit, those channels are again owned by queue list 2. So be cautious about that stuff. The way to handle this, and I think one of the best ways to do this, and this is semi-new to EOS. I think this came in around 2.7 or 2.8. But this is a release flag. So in blind, on a per channel or a per parameter basis, you can now set a release flag. So for example, in this way, I set channel 1, release, enter, and what I get, little R's, and my value grays out. And whenever I play Q2/5, it is going to let go of those channels, right? And I changed this a little bit, so it should say in Q5 release these parameters. This is important because if I'm doing something like a loop, a link loop, I want Q1 through 4 to run, right? Those are my chases, those are my move instructions. And I can run that in infinity, for example, but then I want to execute Q2/5 when I'm ready for those channels to actually let go. If we look back at a different slide, here, here, don't forget that when Q2 took ownership of these channels, these values are still in the background, right? The board remembers that we stole these channels, but they used to belong to QList1 of those values. So what a release flag does is it says, let my channels go, right? Like, I'm done controlling them. Let them go back to whatever they were doing before I stole them away, right? So no matter where you are in QList1, you can let these things be released, and it will send them back to those previous values. So what this QList now looks like, because Q4 was presumably important, right? You were using that for playback. You add an additional Q, and that release flag lets go of those channels wherever it is, and sends those values back to whatever they were doing in QList1 without needing an assert in QList1 and without needing a move instruction. So it's a really elegant way to hand control back once you've stolen it, right? So kind of keep that in mind. Again, I think if you're running something like a loop, the way that I would do this is if I had this running because I had track values. If I was running, I executed QList2 in Q1/4. I let this thing run as long as I want it. I want to let it release back in Q1/5. I would execute Q1/5, would execute Q2/5, right? So that is the way to go. So it's a really nice way to let control go back over regardless of the state of QList1. I think this is a lot more elegant than before we had release flag, when there was really no good way to do this without QList1 being in a known state. Another thing to consider when you're in this area maybe is just to clean up, tidy up stuff. Maybe you want to send Q2 back to 0. Maybe you don't, because those values that's going to adversely affect your QList1. Just know that it's an option that you can do as a cleanup. Okay. So release flags are awesome. A quick summary. Assert means I am taking back ownership. And if you've worked in a single QList environment for a long time, you'll know that we block and assert all of our blackouts, all of our tops of scenes, because block is edit, assert is playback. Assert says, make the stage look like this queue says, no matter what. Release in a multi-QList environment is super, super useful because it says, I've stolen these, I'm done with them, give them back to whoever had them before me. And so both are very, very useful, just in different scenarios. So think about how each can benefit you. Release flags can potentially be beneficial in a QList environment with like subs and things like that too. So just be aware. So I think that was dense. I hope that my examples were clear. You know, Rob usually would have some like, well, you should explain this better. But but I'm going to go ahead and go to the question board. And if you have other questions about this before we go into our last little section, feel free to type it in. Do you publish these webinars? Yes, we do. ETC Study Hall is the thing that you search on YouTube. When channels are released, Tony asks, do they return to their values at the start of the queue or when the queue completes? Tony, when channels are released, do they return their values at the start of the queue or when the queue completes? This is all about ownership. So I guess I should explain ownership a bit more clearly. The board tracks on a channel-by-channel basis, and actually on a parameter-by-parameter basis, who last owned it, right? And there's rules of arbitration that allow you to figure out who is allowed to own what. One of the basic rules that we use is HTP or LTP, right? So let's take two subs, for example, that have both channel 1 stored in them. Subs default to highest takes precedent, which is an arbitration rule for who should own this channel, right? So if I've got channel sub 1 at 50, which sets channel 1 to 50, sub 2 can go 49 and under all at once, and it will never take control of channel 1, right? Because highest takes precedent says whoever is highest will win. As soon as I get to 51%, the board hands over ownership of channel 1 to sub 2. And as long as I'm above 50%, because it's higher, sub 1 is still in the background at 50%. The board knows that it's in its background. And as soon as sub 2 gets below 50% again, it is no longer HTP, so it hands over ownership back to sub 1, right? So that's something that maybe we as letting people that have been doing for a long time just sort of feel in our bones that just like take for granted. That is an HTP ownership handoff, right? And a hand back. LTP, which is latest takes precedence, says whoever gave me the last move instruction will win, right? So in the same example, LTP, we make you match intensity first. So my sub 2 would have to get to 50% first, because in a true LTP environment, if you got to 1%, then the light would like snap to 0, and that's not desired. So once you're above 50%, though, you can retain control of that channel 1 because LTP says, I was the latest to talk to this and gain ownership of this channel. I'm going to retain ownership of this channel. And the only way to let go of channel 1 and give it back to what it was doing in an LTP handover is to release it. And that's why in our playback areas on all of our desks, there's a release hard key. Holding release and hitting the load button of sub 2 is exactly this same behavior. It says, whatever sub 2 owns now, let go. And for channel 1, that means, sub 1 was in my most recent history. I am going to go back and be owned by whatever sub 1 is doing right now because it's in my background, right? So LTP is how queue lists default. And that handover happens as a one-way thing, right? If I've got a move instruction in queue list 2, it steals control, and I need, without any other tools, a move instruction in queue list 1 to steal it back, right? But that gets complicated if there are lots of move instructions that are continually happening over here, or if I don't know where I'm going to be. So release is the tool for saying, let it go. And we remember in the background for channel 1 that queue list 1 had owned it previously and that it was at this level. So I hope that makes sense. You can do those handoffs with move instructions, but asserting something says, gimme, right? Whoever had it, I don't care who had it, gimme, I need it here now. Release says, I had it, I don't know who I stole it from, but give it back to whoever they were. So release and assert are good playback tools depending on which area you care about. I hope that was clear. Gosh, I could do a whole session on priority and ownership. Priority is another level of arbitration, which says I've got a higher priority. I'm going to take ownership because I'm at a higher priority, right? And that stomps LTP, HTP rules. Things that are the same priority, we arbitrate on HTP or LTP. So I hope that makes sense. That was a really long answer, Tony, to a very simple question, but I hope it clarifies that. We've got a couple of people asking about the keystroke for release. It's in blind, so this is a blind function. And when you have a channel on the command line, it's a soft key. So in Nomad, on a console, wherever you want to be, this is a flag that you set in blind. I'm going to try and clear all of those. That's another. Jake is asking about higher priority. I think I answered that, Jake. Will the move instruction queue list still take precedence if another queue list is higher priority? The answer is yes. In this sort of example that I did, that may not be beneficial unless you plan on using release, right? But priority would force ownership immediately, right? So just be careful with that as well. We don't do the HTTP handoff like we do with subs. Does go to queue and load queue list work the same? Does load queue list take all the channels? Joel asks, I think I'm going to answer this. There's a couple questions here. Does go to queue and load queue list work the same? No. So go to queue is a get me here now. So if you work in theater, I call it a tech tool, right? I need to get to this whole look because we're skipping to this point in the book. If you're on a film and TV set, right, we're going to this point in the script. Like, I need to get my whole stage to be here now. So we don't generally deal with timing. We don't deal with a lot of, like, there's some fade stuff in the background that we do. But generally, it's just we don't care what it looks like, kind of get it here now. When you load a queue into pending, either through a link, like we did the example, or by saying Q2/1 load, when you hit go, that will queue that thing up as the next queue in the stack, as if it had always been there. What that really matters for is things like marks, right? So if you have automark on or not even, we try and make that transition as pretty as possible. So go to queue, enter. We're going to do whatever we can to get to that queue as quickly as we can. As soon as you say Q2/1 load, the board looks at any light that isn't on and tries to preset it before you turn it on. So we're trying to tidy up that transition and make it as clean of a transition as possible so that you can kind of go out of order, and that's the whole point. So that's more of an in situ, like I'm in a show and the actor just dropped 5 pages and I need to like hop 12 queues. Q101 load go is going to be a much more elegant transition than a go to queue. And the more time you can give the board to, like, Q11 or Q111 load before you hit the go, the better chance it has to get some of your movers and your LEDs in a better position. So I hope that answers those questions, Joel. Let me know if you have anything else. Can you sneak a go to queue? Good question. Go to queue has timing associated with it. So you can say go to Q5 time 8. So sneak, not really needed because it has timing functions built into it. We will use the default time, and that's macroable as well, so you can change that based on where you are in your show. Kent, can you talk about the timings of releasing channels? Releasing to a background queue. Yeah, Kent, let's save some of that stuff before, after all of this, because that has some ramifications on general playback too. But the releasing in a queue list deals with your queue time, right? So it will adhere to those things. Matt reminded me of something which is great. Thank you, Matt. Go to Q5 time, enter, will run that queue with its timing. So that's a very good shortcut. Go to Q had a lot of expansions added to it a couple builds ago. So there are a bunch of soft keys in Go to Q when you hit it now. I would encourage you to explore those and play with those because we do a lot of fun stuff with the way you can go to Q now. Michael, let me read your question. Michael asks, I'm probably going to butcher this question, Michael. If you have queue list 1 handoff to queue list 2, got it. Is there a way to dynamically update queue list 2 so that it takes control of all of queue list 1's channels? Example, channels 1 through 4 in queue list 1 and 2. I add channel 5 later to queue list 1 only, but always want queue list 2 to take control of all queue list 1 channels. There's not currently a way to do that. You would have to have move instructions in queue list 2 for channel 5, which you would have added. I guess my question back, and we can take this, I'll move on, but if you have time to type it, I guess my question back is, where would you expect channel 5 to go if you haven't given it any values in queue list 2? How's the board going to know what to do with it when it takes control? Would you expect it to be the same values that it's currently in queue list 1? I'd be interested to get some more clarity on that, but the question. Joel asks, as far as switching between queue list or executing queue list, does it load using the queue timing? Yeah, so a link is just a permanent load, right? So if you link to Q2/1, it's the same as typing Q2/1 load. You know, the behavior will be the same there. It's just always there for you. A Q2/1 load is often a get out of jail, like, uh-oh, things are a mess and I need to do this when I wasn't anticipating doing it. So we've got about 45 minutes, 40 minutes, which I think we'll be fine in, because this section I think is pretty straightforward, but I want to make sure we have some more time with questions. So the last kind of way we think about a multi-queue list environment is what I call concurrent playback. We looked at this a little bit, like I always joke when I'm teaching classes on multi-queue list environments that there's two ways that you use multiple queue lists, and I always say it's actually 2.5 because linear is one way, concurrent playback is another way, and then the example we just did is a 2.5. It's kind of a combination of both of these. Doing handoffs is the most complicated thing you can do with multiple queue lists. So this one should be pretty easy. When we talk about concurrent playback, either for a multi-programmer environment or for organizational purposes, just if you were running something like a multi-venue walkthrough experience or a museum or something, the important thing here is that channels belong to a single queue list generally. There's nothing that says that they can't obviously belong to multiple queue lists like we just saw, but then you're starting to worry about handovers, all this logic, and that's not generally what we're doing in concurrent playback as a rule of thumb. In this playback idea, the sum of all of the queue list contributors, so if we've got 5 queue lists and they're all in Q8, that's the stage look, right? Because they each own a section of the channels individually. We look at them as a single component on stage. It is generally how these things go. Or they're operating independently, right? Again, the idea that we're doing, Halloween's coming up, a haunted house, right? You may want single queue lists to operate in their own time, but you don't care because all the channels are only in that room and we're not doing big handoffs. So really quick examples here. I've got queue list 1, which owns channels 1 through 3. Got queue list 2, which owns 5 through 6, and 7 through 9 are in queue list 3. So I literally just broke apart this table. There's no magic to this, right? So just keep in mind that the easiest way to do this is to, at the beginning, decide what channels live in what playback, in what queue list. So what's nice about this is instead of having to execute each individual queue when you want to do a go, like we were talking about up above, at the first queue of what we'll call, what I call like the calling list, the stage manager list, which in this example is queue list 1, but could be any list. All I have to say is I'm going to hit go from queue list 1, queue list 1/1, execute, Q2/enter, or Q2/ and Q3/enter. And now, anytime I hit go on queue list 1, it is going to fire like numbered queues in any of the linked queue lists. So what does this mean? I hit go on 1 in queue list 1, and because I have a Q1 in both lists 2 and 3, those are going to fire, and they're going to play back whatever they play back for their channels, right? So again, this is a great way. If we think about queue list 1 is my conventional fixtures, queue list 2 are my moving lights, queue list 3 is media servers or video or whatever. Now Q1 is holistically the stage picture, right? So that's really, really useful. If I go again on queue list 1, just with a go button, queue list 2 goes because it has a Q2, but queue list 3 doesn't go. There is no queue. It will sit in whatever values are in Q1. Okay? That's expected. Just be aware of that. If you need queue list 3 to go, you need to put a like numbered queue in there, either in the main list or elsewhere. Again, coming up here, I'm going to go on Q2.5 and just queue list 1 advances. There are no queues 2.5 in any of my other lists. Next, I'm going to go on Q3. As expected, both advance to Q3, but you'll notice now that my queue list 1 does not have a Q4. If I expect Q4 to be called in list 2, I need to add it to my call list, my stage manager list, whatever, because going on Q5 is going to jump queue list 2 to Q5. It's not just calling a go command, it's saying go on like numbered queues, right? So if you've ever done MIDI as a go MIDI show control between consoles, this is exactly what an execute across multiple queue lists is doing. Queue numbers have to be like for them to function. That's great, because if you look at something like queue list 3, which is my video, I may not need queues throughout the show. I may only have 5 queues in my whole show. I don't want to have to record dummy queues in all of queue list 3. But what I can do is just put in the queues that are relevant and let those values sit until I go there. There's a button here that I, just before I started, I forgot. I was like, oh, I should have put this in the presentation. There's a function when you link these queues in your queue list called out of sequence sync, or OSS sync. And what it means is that right now, let me see if I can, I don't think I built this example well. Let's pretend, yeah, we're sitting in Q5. So if we were sitting in Q99 in the show, and all 3 queue lists were in Q99, right? If I say go to Q5 in my queue list 1, queue list 2 is going to go there because it has a Q5, but queue list 3 won't go there. It'll stay in Q99 because there's no like numbered queue for it. And that's a problem, right? If I'm trying to, in tech, go to that location in space, I need to know that it's going to go to that place. So with queue list 3, I could set I could set out of sequence sync, and by going to Q5, it knows, oh, I need to put that queue list 3 in the most recent queue that it would have been in linear playback, which means that it would be in this state right now, which is queue list 5. So I probably explained that terribly. Out of sequence sync is really, really good for bouncing around a multi-queue list environment like this when you don't have like number queues for all of your lists. So be very cautious about that and know that OSS can help you. My friend Don did mention, yeah, I had an error back here. The syntax is Q1/execute Q2/. So you don't put a queue number in here. Thank you, Don. Always helpful. Cool. So this is another place where, again, I didn't want to dig deeply into partitions because they're a little odd scope for what we wanted to talk about today. But in a multi-programmer environment in particular, if you're dealing with these multiple queue lists, partitions are very useful. Partitions, by their design, make it difficult to control channels that are outside of your partition. It's not impossible for safety reasons, but it is, you have to be very intentional about it. Partitions prevent recording and updating to channels that are outside of your partition. So again, if you've decided that you want ownership of a certain group of channels to be assigned to a particular partition, then that makes it easy and you don't accidentally record other people's stuff. Partitions can be assigned to a queue list, which is useful. So consider that if you're using them. And then just from a good practices standpoint, making sure that partitions, it's easy to line up your partition number with your queue list number, with your user number. Again, there's nothing that says that you have to do it that way. A lot of people work in that way because they have a little bit of organization to deal with, right? It's an organizational tool. So I would say if you need to work in a multi-programmer environment, that is useful. And yeah, go check it out. So that is kind of all the prepared stuff that I had. We have a half an hour. We have a lot of time. So I guess my question is, what questions do you have? Good question. So John asks, when using update, which queue list will a channel update into, especially channels that haven't been recorded into a queue list yet? Yeah, so an update, as I think you've heard me talk about before, is a save changes. And more precisely, it's a save changes to wherever this data is coming from. So this has a little bit to do with ownership, right? If channel 1 were owned by queue list 1 and then queue list 2 grabbed it, and then you make changes and you update, that's going to be updated into queue list 2, right? So again, just being really conscious of where that stuff's going. That will show up in your update dialog box. So I'm sure a number of you have also heard me say that there are 3 keystrokes when you update: update, pause, enter, right? Like that update dialog box gives you really good information as to what channels are going where. Take a second to understand and read that if you're concerned about where those things are going to be owned. Because what I've seen happen is people will make those changes and not realize that they updated into the wrong place until much, much later, where undo is not your friend anymore. So just be cautious there. And then channels that are unowned, we don't update those to anything because we haven't saved those changes anywhere, right? So you'll want to store those to a particular place, and so the board knows where update can target it to. Something that is useful is your about queue tool, as Don mentioned here. So holding about and hitting queue will show you in live on a parameter by parameter basis who currently owns that parameter, who's contributing it, right? So if you play with some of these examples, you'll see that, like that middle example that we did, that sort of long half handover example, that's a really good place to hold about, hit Q, and you'll see what list owns it. So that can help you in some of those updating things. Let's see here. Don, sorry, I warned you that this would maybe take a little while. Thank you, Don. Always a pleasure. Michael asks, could there be a future with queue list direct selects? I guess if your intention is to get them onto the command line, I would say that for now, the macro is the best way to do that. I guess I'd be interested to know in what other thoughts you had for what that direct select would do, other than get it on the command line. Feel free to put it in here or send me an email, Michael. Joel asks a really good question. When playing multiple queue lists back and having the master stage manager list, is there a way to get every queue number from every queue list together back into that list without going through each queue list to see what numbers are being used? No, that doesn't exist right now. That's a manual action, so you need to go through and kind of manually put in those blank queues. I know that's a bit of a bummer, but that's where a split screen can be really useful. Opening up maybe a blind view of your stage manager queue list or your master queue list, and a blind view of the queue list index, and being able to parse that stuff pretty quickly. Nothing right now that's automagic about any of that stuff. So that's a good question to ask. Cool. Let's see. That seems to be all that's coming in for now. Oh, this is a good one. Sorry, I'm scanning through some stuff. What's the coolest sort of out-of-the-box use of multiple queue lists you've seen? I would say probably nested queue lists or like a themed walkthrough space. One example that I saw, and I'll try and explain this with my hands moving. There was a venue that was like, we'll call it a club. It was an experience venue, but like a nightclub where there were multiple rooms and some common areas and some private lounges off of some spaces. The way that they architected the show file was that each room, each portion of each room had a queue list that ran with, time sinks or follows or hangs or whatever they wanted to do to make that space and the elements in that space kind of function. But then there was another, so there were maybe 5 or 6 of those in certain rooms. But then there was sort of a master queue list, right, a parent queue list, that, at certain times or at certain events or with certain triggers, the whole space could go into a certain look, right? So it would trigger certain cues or things like that. But what was nice is that room could be like taken offline, and the rest of the venue could keep working. So if they were doing, redoing a room or something, they could turn off some of that pairing using like solo mode or something. So each of these spaces had like children, we'll call them grandchildren queue lists, and then a parent queue list. And then there's sort of a grandparent queue list, which was the grand poobah for the entire venue, and that allowed you know, the midnight celebration thing to happen. That allowed, you know, venue-wide, just practical things like cleaning and close of venue and things like that. So I thought that was really interesting because I've seen a lot of venues that are individually controlled. You know, you walk through something like Sleep No More in New York. I've been through a bunch of times, and I think I don't know for sure, but they have individual queue lists for each room that run on various time sequences and stuff. But the idea that you could like kind of nest those things was an interesting way to think about it. So Ken says a good example is shows that have multiple casts. That's actually a really good example. So Joel asks, let me read this. Yes. So when adding a queue list, when adding a queue into the master list, what is the best way to do it if the main queue list does not have any move instructions? So one of the ways you can do that is to assert that queue, right? But the blue 0 queue is also something that's useful, right? So those are like make me playback functions. Great. Oh, a good question. Asking about queue lists and faders. Queue lists, in order to be active, have to live on a fader somewhere. So if you've gone through your faders and unmapped your individual lists to clean them up because you're like, this, you know, queue list 1 is going to run my other 3 lists or whatever. As soon as those queues get gone on, they get a go trigger, either through you or a macro or an execute or whatever. They'll show up on the first available fader. And that's because we need to have them be somewhere where they're mapped. So one thing that is a common practice is if you just want those out of the way from an organizational standpoint, and you don't want them moving around and popping up where you don't expect them. I know a lot of programmers and design teams will put those queue lists just on a page up out of the way that they're never using, so that they always stay there and they're always mapped, so that they can play back, but that they're not hopping around and you don't get unexpected stuff. Yeah, Michael says for queue list direct selects, the wish list is seeing what queue lists are active and selected, the queue list to load, release the queue list, naming queue lists and managing queue lists, seeing what content, what queue lists are available. There's another big desk in this industry that has a really similar playback section. Stay tuned. We have some different ideas that fit more into our ecosystem than just putting it maybe on a direct select. So stay tuned to, I don't know, maybe 3.1. We're working on some stuff. Cool. That seems to, I think I got most everybody. If you have additional questions, again, don't ever hesitate to reach out. I'm happy to answer emails. Timeliness is always suspect, but I will get to them just as soon as I can. Yeah, don't hesitate to reach out with questions, ideas, or if you need help with anything. So thanks everybody for joining. I hope it was useful, and I hope you stay well, and we will see you at the next one. Everybody take care.